Rome had a lot of emperors, but who were the worst? Join me and guest LJ Trafford as we discuss 3 possible candidates on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome, my name's Neil, and in this episode I welcome back the author LJ Trafford to talk about some of Rome's worst emperors. LJ has recently released a book all about just that. It's titled Ancient Rome's Worst Emperors, and I picked out a selection of 3 emperors from it who we discuss, and we even get the chance at the end to answer some questions which have been kindly sent in. If you're not familiar with LJ or her books, well, LJ is a writer of both fiction and non-fiction about ancient Rome. In fiction, she has tackled 69 CE, the year of the 4 emperors, in her 4-book series Palatine, Galba's Men, Otho's Regret, and Vitellius's Feast. As well as writing short stories covering the downfall of arch-villain Sejanus, the marriage of Emperor Nero to wife number 3 Statilia Messalina, and a tale involving deadly palace politics, a kidnapping, and an improbably escaped hippo called Help. One of our eunuchs is missing. In non-fiction, she is the author of How to Survive in Ancient Rome, a travel guide for the discerning tourist to Rome in the year 95 CE, and has tackled the troubling, difficult, but never less than fascinating subject of sex in her book Sex and Sexuality in Ancient Rome. Her latest book is called Ancient Rome's Worst Emperors. As I mentioned, LJ has been on the podcast to talk about her books. There's an episode where we chat about How to Survive in Ancient Rome and another on Sex and Sexuality in Ancient Rome. If you haven't done so already, go have a listen. They're really fun and interesting discussions. Just a couple of things to mention before you get to the chat. Firstly, I received a copy of this book. I'll always be open about that kind of thing. It doesn't affect my opinion of it, and you'll hear me recommending it. I think it's a really good read. In fact, I wouldn't have an episode with a book which I wouldn't either buy myself, which is actually more often the case, or recommend. And believe it or not, I do get a fair few offers. And just to clarify on a wider point, my podcast is a hobby. I don't make any money from it. For example, those ads I sometimes feature are swaps that I've done with other podcasters, or I've provided the ad because I think there's a particular content maker or a resource which might be of interest to you. You know, get word round, that kind of a thing. That segues nicely to the standard appeal for reviews and ratings. Please do this. I don't have a budget for ads or marketing. If you give the podcast a rating on, say, Apple or Spotify, it makes it more visible to other people through the magical recommend algorithms. On Spotify, you can actually go one step extra and review each individual episode. You can find me on X, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as Ancient Blogger, with this podcast as @HoundAncient on X as well. And of course, there's my website, ancientblogger.com. I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts were on my selections and, just any feedback that you have. Finally, just be aware that there's mention of death, suicide, and general nastiness in this episode. But I suspect you'd expect this given the nature of what we're talking about, but, I thought it worth just flagging for you. Right then, here's our chat. LJ, as ever, was absolutely fantastic, so I really hope that you enjoy it. LJ, 3's a charm, as they say. It's your 3rd time actually coming on here, so welcome and thanks.
No, it's fine.
We're here to talk about your book, Rome's Worst Emperors, and discuss 3 examples which I selected. But before we get to them, how did you go about this task exactly? Because it's a very difficult one. How did you go about it? What were the metrics that you used?
Well, I really got, as in with my previous 2 non-fiction books, it was a title that I was given to write. Mm-hmm. So I've written 2 previous non-fiction for Pen and Sword, which was Sex and Sexuality in Ancient Rome and How to Survive in Ancient Rome. In both those cases, they gave me a title and they gave me a book brief, which told me exactly what I had to write, what topics I had to cover. And with this one, they just gave me the title, Ancient Rome's Worst Emperors, and said, go off and write the book brief yourself. So I went off and I wrote a kind of brief about what I thought I was going to write about, which subsequently I've looked at, and it bears no resemblance to the finished book at all. Because my original idea was I was also going to include some of ancient Rome's worst empresses as well,
okay.
A bit of variety, even out the kind of gender balance of evilness. And I was going to have kind of themed chapters on kind of like the Praetorian Guard, because they pop up a lot in kind of worst emperor's rule. So I had all these grand plans. And then I realised just how big a task I'd set myself,
Yeah.
and that those kind of things I really didn't have space to include those kind of things, because I have 85,000 words, and I'd set myself like all of Roman history from Augustus up to the fall of the West in kind of, is it 476 with Honorius? And that's a huge, huge amount of time to set myself. And my metrics, I started off thinking I was going to choose one emperor, one worst emperor from each dynasty. And then again, that proved to be far too big a job, because there's quite a lot of dynasties and quite a lot of emperors. And again, that was just too much to include. So then I went back to the drawing board again, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to choose a selection who I think worst emperors, and I'm going to judge it. And I'm going to judge it by Augustus, who's Rome's first emperor.
Oh, okay.
Who very handily writes a kind of summary of his life, the Res Gestae, which tells you all the brilliant things he did. And it's all about him. Barely anybody else gets a mention in it. It's, I did this and I did that.
Yeah.
And that seemed like quite a good blueprint of what a good emperor should be. A good emperor should, fight battles and win. They should build great kind of palaces. They should be doing stuff. So that seemed something that I could compare who follows Augustus with. See who didn't quite measure up to the mark, wasn't quite as good. And the other metrics which kind of helped me was Suetonius, who writes a biography of the first 12 emperors. He very handily splits his kind of biographies into their good deeds and their bad deeds, which is really handy for me, because then that gave me another kind of set of metrics that I could compare with. I could say, well, if Suetonius thinks this is bad behaviour, who's the worst I can find who matches up to that kind of behaviour? So I kind of started with that, with starting what a good emperor was, looking at Augustus, and then kind of moving it on from there to try and choose some worst ones. But again, it's a bit kind of random in that I wanted to show kind of a wide range of what a worst emperor could be. I didn't want to just do all the ones that everybody's heard of and just, Caligula, Nero, etc., sexual depravity all over the place, orgies, all that kind of stuff. I wanted a kind of variety of ways in which you could be worse. Kind of people who've just been a bit over promoted.
Yeah.
People who found themselves in the job who just aren't up to the task, and I wanted that kind of variety. So it's not, because even I, who've written many books about kind of sexuality, get a bit tired of all the sexual depravity. You want to write about something else for a bit, every now and then anyway.
Well, I remember you coming on, and the two books that you spoke about earlier, you came on and spoke about how to survive in ancient Rome and sex and sexuality in ancient Rome. And they were both very popular episodes. And I think the way you've approached it is a very good way, because there is, I don't think, one particular route to answering that question. It's a pub question. It's really a question about a question. How do you go about assessing emperors and understanding them? I like the point you make about emperors sometimes being over-promoted, the sort of Peter principle, or, pun intended, the princeps principle. And there's certainly one of those that we'll deal with. I really enjoyed the book. I've not read all of it so far, and I read around because I wanted to get a good idea of who I wanted to select. And my first thought was, I want to choose someone from each era, as it were, of the empire. What this book did, though, and this is to its credit, is it moved me north of the 2nd century AD, which, generally speaking, for those who have listened to my podcast, I don't tend to go north of. I get a nosebleed. It's something that when I was at university and afterwards doing my master's, I never really broke through that post-Hadrian era.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out the reason most people don't kind of go north of the 2nd century is there's not as many sources going forward.
Okay,
so it's
point.
more difficult to kind of find out about those emperors. And I certainly learned loads writing this book, because there was loads I hadn't even heard of that are kind of going through, especially in the kind of 3rd century, when you get emperor after emperor after emperor, and they last just a few months. So yeah, it was an education for me as well, in kind of learning of some new things.
But we're going to start with an emperor from the period that I'm familiar with, and one I imagine would appear on most people's, say, top 3, probably top 5. He was the 3rd Roman emperor, and though his reign was short, and I'll come to that later, it was certainly eventful. We'll start then with Caligula. LJ, perhaps you can enlighten us and start with exactly how he became emperor and what his background was.
Yeah, so Caligula is as you say, he's the 3rd emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which starts with Augustus, who's the first one, and then continues with Augustus' stepson Tiberius. And the problem they had in that kind of first instance was that Augustus, although we call him kind of Rome's first emperor, he never really held that title because that title didn't really exist. There was no post of emperor. What he had was a kind of collection of powers that he'd accumulated and been granted that allowed him to act as he did, act as an emperor. But there was no role. So the first big test of it was, if there's no job of emperor, how do you hand it over to a successor?
Yeah.
And it's kind of to Tiberius's kind of credit that this new role of emperor keeps going for the next 4 centuries, because it could so easily have kind of crumbled. But he's just competent enough to kind of keep it going and keep it running. And Tiberius rules for, I think it's 24 years. He has a good long reign. At the end of Tiberius's reign, there was certainly a very full treasury, but there was a very lot of unhappy people. He was an elderly man. He'd kind of given up on Rome. He'd left Rome 10 years previously to retire to the island of Capri, where he stayed. So the people of Rome hadn't seen him for a good decade. And he'd left Rome in charge of his Praetorian prefect, a man by the name of Sejanus, who's kind of the arch villain of kind of history. And Sejanus himself had kind of delusions of power. Whether he wanted to be emperor or whether he wanted to get closer to power, we don't know. He's had an affair with Tiberius's daughter-in-law, Livilia, and we think maybe he wanted to act as regent to Tiberius's grandson.
Right.
And he went about kind of accumulating power by knocking off and bumping off any kind of people who were in his way. And in his way was a lady called Agrippina, who was Caligula's mother, who was a granddaughter of Augustus. So she had a very close link, and she was very popular with the people. She's married to Germanicus, who was a war hero. And she had a good selection of sons. She had 3 sons and a collection of 3 daughters. So she had a good number of heirs who were in the way. And Sejanus slowly set about kind of bumping them off one by one, setting them up. And Agrippina ended up being kind of exiled, and she had a horrible exile. She was beaten so badly by the guards that she lost an eye. Caligula's brother was starved to death, and he was so hungry he ate the kind of innards of his own mattress in desperation. And so they were slowly getting bumped off one by one, and there was just Caligula left in the way. And it was Caligula's grandmother Antonia who finally got the news to kind of Tiberius of what Sejanus was doing, and Sejanus kind of fell from power very, very quickly. And then all there was left in the succession was Caligula. So he's the last one left. So he's had quite a rough childhood. He sat there and he's watched his mother and his brothers being bumped off. His father died very mysteriously in Syria. There was kind of rumours that he'd been poisoned and been murdered. So he's growing up in this kind of atmosphere of fear. And even more fear is when Tiberius, invites him to come to Capri with him, to act as his successor, his proven heir. So he's actually, stuck on an island with the man who's responsible for killing his family. Yeah. And he's got to keep a kind of straight face almost. He's got to suck up to Tiberius despite how he might personally feel about him. And you can imagine the kind of pressure on a kind of very young man having to do that. So he's the heir because there's not really anybody else left. And I think he's 25 years old when Tiberius dies. And then he's thrust into the kind of limelight as this very young emperor. And the people are delighted because they haven't seen Tiberius for years. He was an old man. He was cruel. They didn't like him. And they got this kind of young man coming in who's the son of a war hero and the Agrippina who they loved. And, he starts off his reign in a very good stead. They adore him. As he comes into Rome, they call him, their chickling, their duck, their darling. He's got a good way in. I guess one thing should be mentioned is that unlike Tiberius, who kind of worked for Augustus and undertaken lots of public roles, he'd fought in the military, in various campaigns, he had a lot of experience. He came to be emperor in his 50s. Caligula was 25. He hasn't got any of that experience. No. He hasn't served in the army. He hasn't had any public roles. He's coming in as a kind of blank slate with really not the experience. But as we say, Tiberius has left him a lot of money. So he's got a good start, which quickly crumbles. In essence, very quickly.
I think that's a really, really good summary you give of him. And I think it is important as well, because though we are ultimately placing a great deal of judgment on some of these individuals, the situations in which they grew up and how it must have affected them is something you have to consider. And Caligula, it's difficult at points to feel sorry for him, but I do have a very big soft spot generally for people. And I often think with Caligula, he had a very tough time of it. But as you say, he starts off well, or it seems that he starts off well, and then it changes. And there's a great line, and I think it's Suetonius, where he covers basically Germanicus and says how great his dad was for the early part of his coverage of Caligula. And then he says, that was for the man, now I must turn to the monster, which is a great line.
Oh, it's a pithy one, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's so much for the man, history must deal with the monster.
What were the changes? What were the things that he did which moved him away from being that, highly considered, liked, almost loved new emperor?
Yeah, I mean, it comes sort of 2 years into his reign. So he has 2 years where he does like the Augustus blueprint of doing all good stuff. He builds stuff. He throws fantastic games for the people. He's very generous. He hands out money to the people. He's kind to the army. He's great to the Senate. He promises the senators these are the end of the dark days of Tiberius, because under Tiberius there have been a lot of treason trials, which a lot of senators had been exiled or lost their lives. And he's coming in and he's throwing all the old things away and it's all going to be great. And then he falls ill. And we don't know what he falls ill with. It's all very vague. There's lots of kind of worry that he's going to die. Their wonderful new emperor is going to die. And one particular guy says, oh, I bet my life, if only, I say to the gods, I'll take my own life if only the emperor will recover. And one of the first things that Caligula does when he recovers is kind of say to this guy, hey, I'm pulling in your favour now. You said you'd do this. Do it. But yeah, whether it's at this point it all changes, but this is how Suetonius kind of represents it, that he wakes up from this illness and he's different, and he starts to kind of become almost sadistically cruel to the Senate.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, from promising he's not going to persecute them anymore, he persecutes them very badly. He sends them to work in the mines. He does cruel things like he invites parents to their children's executions. He invites them in the dead of night, terrifying them to a meeting just so he can do a little dance for them. So kind of use a kind of psychological terror for them.
Yeah.
He whizzes through the money that Tiberius had left in the treasury, so there's nothing left within 2 years. So then he has to raise money. So then he's doing things like setting up a brothel in the palace to pay for all these expenses. And then he's doing things like he's encouraging people to put them in his wills so he can inherit their money. And then he can't wait till they die, so then he's having them killed so that he can get to the money quicker. He's just doing it, and even to the people, it was said that he pulled back the awnings on the amphitheatres so that when it was a boiling hot sunny day, they all got sunstroke and suffered. He'd pull people out of the audience, who'd made a noise during his favourite ballet dancers' dance and have them scourged in front of his eyes, which is, very, very badly whipped. If you've ever seen that Mel Gibson film on the life of Christ, what happens to him, that's a scourging. It's not a nice thing. And, it says, he's said to have said at one point, oh, he wished that all of Rome just had one neck so he could slit it at once, so he can kill everybody at once. And he laments that there's been no disasters in his reign, like Augustus lost three legions in Germany were massacred, and there was a big earthquake under Tiberius, and he wants a big disaster under his reign. So he's kind of just like, everything is bad, and then you get onto kind of sexual taboos he's breaking. He's kind of, at dinner parties, he's choosing his senators' wives and taking them off and having sex with them and then bringing them back to the table and then giving a full commentary on how bad they were in bed, in front of them and their husbands. He's just kind of breaking every kind of tradition that he can. He starts to think he's a god. He sets up a temple with a statue of himself, which he puts his own clothes on each day. So he changes the outfit on the representation of the god. Yeah, chooses the outfit. And there's a point in which he tries to put a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem, in Judea, which does not go down well.
That's a singularly very bad idea. Yeah.
A very bad idea. And, he starts to believe he's Jupiter and that he's, part of the gods and that he's divine. And he dresses, in clothes that are beyond kind of mankind and more kind of divine. So it's just everything you can think of that's a kind of a bad emperor. He becomes our kind of criteria, I think, of what we think of is of a worst emperor. And that kind of question of what would you do? Would you play along to survive or would you make a stand kind of thing?
So there are a couple of instances that you've mentioned and a couple others that I remember. One is that he makes his horse consul. Is it consul or a senator? And People have sort of indicated that was a very, that was the height of madness. However, you could also say it was just a comment on how just awful and subservient and lackluster the Senate were.
He doesn't, I think the thing is he doesn't actually make his horse a consul.
Oh.
He says it, but it doesn't happen. It's one of those things that gets passed down.
Right,
as a
okay.
kind of, so the phrase, he always says he may as well make his horse a senator, which is saying, like, exactly as you said, it's a comment on the kind of the senators and their kind of what he thinks of them, very, very little, that he may as well have a horse as a senator.
And the other thing, which is the dancing and talking to the gods, and I often wondered whether or not that was him testing people. What will you believe? Will you believe anything I tell you? If I tell you that up is down, down is up, left is right, you're just going to say yes to me. It seems like he was playing games with people a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, it just feels like he's toying with them, particularly the Senate. He's toying with what he can make them do. He's testing kind of what it means to be emperor. He's the first one to kind of test it. And, Augustus and Tiberius, to some extent, are trying to pretend they're kind of ordinary guys who just happen to have all this power. And Caligula's one who kind of pulls back that curtain and says, I have the power, you will do what I say. So, there's a feeling that he's testing it. And there's a feeling that it's sadistic because these senators of, Caligula's family who were wiped out by Sejanus, these are the senators who voted for that to happen.
Yeah.
These are the people who signed those forms that led to his family's death. And at some point, he suddenly kind of wakes up to that. And, suddenly all the kind of the little chickie and all the darlings that they've been throwing at him and all the honours, he suddenly sees it for what it is, that it's just all lies. And these are the people who killed his family. And that kind of then makes a bit more sense of why he so sadistically kind of picks on the Senate, because they are responsible. And he sees how they puffed up Sejanus and they puffed up Tiberius, and now they're puffing up him, and he realises it's all just air. It's all just words, I think, personally.
I think that's a very good point. There is one other thing I just want to mention, is that he gets criticised for incest, and it's worth mentioning that incest was something you got criticised with all the time.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of debate whether it actually happened, because it gets mentioned in Suetonius, who's writing sort of 60 or 70 years after Caligula is dead. But Tacitus, who's writing a bit closer, although we don't have his chapter on Caligula, we can kind of work out that he doesn't mention the incest, because he talks about Caligula's sister Agrippina the Younger, who's the mother of Nero. And Agrippina the Younger, in order to get Nero on the throne, married her own uncle Claudius, which was incest, but Claudius had the law changed so that it wasn't. And that's the kind of point at which Tacitus, could throw in that H-bomb of, well, of course she'd slept with her brother before, so incest, was easy for her. But he doesn't do it.
Right.
And you kind of think, well, why doesn't he throw that line in? And it's likely because that's not a story then when Tacitus is writing.
No.
That, the kind of incest with the sisters that comes up with Caligula wasn't a story that was being told at that time. It's a later invention. It kind of gets added in later.
Yeah.
As part of kind of folklore, much like kind of making his horse a senator kind of gets added in later. So you feel like the stories of Caligula actually even get exaggerated even after he's dead. They get exaggerated some more as time goes on. One
final example, and you speak about this in the book, the seashells.
This is the one that people pull out as kind of, oh, he's really crazy. Caligula kind of goes on campaign, and I mean, the whole thing's a farce from beginning to end. They go to Germany and he wants to fight some enemies, but there's nobody to fight. So they kind of just send some people into the forest to pretend to be the enemy and kind of let him capture them so he has a victory. And, he gets to have his own little triumph on a kind of made up victory. But at one point he decides he's going to invade Britain, and he lines up all his troops and they're ready to go across, to invade Britain. And then he just orders them to pick up seashells and then declares that he's beaten Neptune, god of the sea, by doing this. And that's the story that kind of nobody can kind of make sense of and go, well, surely that's mad, taking all those legions, pretending you're going to have an invasion, and then deciding you've won because they've collected so many seashells and you've beaten Neptune. It's, it's a really, really odd story. Yeah. But people have tried to kind of justify it and try and find a kind of an answer to it by suggesting the word for kind of seashells is quite similar to the word for kind of military huts.
Right.
So there's a suggestion that it's a translation error, and actually was ordering them to pick up kind of military huts, which
Right.
doesn't seem terribly plausible to me.
More within the context then of a sort of military exercise, because after all, you have to
Yeah.
remember as well that the invasion of Britain occurs under the following emperor. So it's perhaps not an unfeasible thing to think about doing.
No, and there's been a suggestion, it was his troops, Claudius had some troops who were refusing to go across the kind of water to invade Britain and were mutinying, and this was, perhaps something similar happened to Caligula, and this was his punishment for them.
Right, okay.
Which again, there's no evidence that they kind of did mutiny, so that seems a bit kind of tenuous.
Mm.
But I think it does. I mean, if you think about the way he treats the Senate and the way he likes humiliating people and humiliating senators, this kind of fits into the same kind of thing, humiliating the troops, taking these big, strong armies and making them pick up seashells like children and build collections. It kind of fits into that kind of like, I'm emperor, I'm God, I can do whatever I like, and, I'm better than you, and I can make you pick up these seashells. So I kind of think it fits into that kind of wanting to humiliate, that kind of sadistic glee he takes in kind of taking bits of Roman society and just making them look stupid, from the Senate to the army,
That's a very good point. How does it end for Caligula?
He ends up getting stabbed to death, horribly. Him and some, what Suetonius described as inoffensive senators, who I always feel a bit sorry for, who were just going about their general business and got in the way of this kind of stab fest. But he's not killed by the Senate, and he's not really killed for any great noble reason. As in a lot of assassinations, you kind of look at them, and behind kind of noble gestures, there's generally something petty and little going on.
Oh, completely.
It's the kind of root cause of it.
Yeah.
And with Caligula, it was one of his guardsmen, and he had a very high-pitched voice, and Caligula used to make fun of him every day for his high-pitched voice. And when he made up the kind of watch password, he'd give him kind of passwords like Venus or something like that,
okay.
Just to be feminized passwords, and just kept needling at him until the point at which he Cassius turns and decides to kill him. So he's not killed for any kind of noble reason. It's because he made fun of somebody's voice.
As we finish up with Caligula, I wanted to mention about the brevity of his reign. So he reigns for something like 4 years, I think it is, 37 to 41. Yeah, that's right, 4 years. Often people think that's because he was so bad that he was gotten rid of really quickly. The reality is that every emperor had assassination attempts made on them. There were always plots going on. These were common. These were part of the ecosystem of the empire. They were part and parcel of being an emperor. What you can't control is when one is successful, because at some point one will be successful. The fact that it happened after 4 years isn't a comment on how bad Caligula was in that context. Because again, these people aren't doing it for their own, or rather the altruistic nature of things. They're not doing it to free the people, though very invariably they will say they are. Very often these are bad people just killing another bad person, as it were. These are sort of interscene gang warfare. It's not something that's being done to make everyone's lives better. And I think that's just worth considering when we come to Caligula on that, because he has a short reign. Would have been very interesting had he had reigned a bit longer and where that had gone. But because he was assassinated only after 4 years, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a comment on how bad it was. It's just someone got to him quicker than other emperors.
Yeah, somebody got through, basically. Somebody had a good plan, essentially. Because, I mean, when we look at Commodus, Commodus could arguably be worse than Caligula in a lot of ways, and he rules for like 12 years. And you get people like later on Aurelian, who is a fantastic emperor. When he's imposed, he wins back parts of the empire that had broken away, such as Palmyra and Gaul, and brings them back into the empire. And he gets the title Restorer of the World. He's that good. And yeah, he gets assassinated. And again, it's for a really petty reason, in that he's one of his servants, Eros, I think is his name in some sources, gets another name in some other ones, killed him because he was frightened that Aurelian would be angry at him for something he had done. And we don't know what this something he had done was, but he so feared Aurelian's reaction that he forged a letter and gave it to the guards that stated that Aurelian wanted to have them all killed, and then persuaded them to kill Aurelian first. So, that's a good emperor. And even he gets assassinated for reasons unknown, but probably quite petty if we ever get to the bottom of it, which we never will now. But so, yeah. And Domitian, who was an emperor, who was assassinated. has a good line about, the life of a prince is an unhappy one because nobody believes there is a conspiracy until he is killed.
Yeah.
So that's a position of being emperor. There are always going to be plots, and there are plots against every single emperor, whether they're classed as good or bad. It's just whether they're successful. And Cassius, in the case of Caligula, was successful. He had a good plan and he executed it well. Other conspiracies weren't well planned or executed.
You name dropped our second emperor, Commodus, who most people will be familiar with from Gladiator. He's played by Joaquin Phoenix.
Which toned him down considerably, I thought. It made him, if you think, he was bad in that film, you know nothing.
Well, yeah, exactly. I knew something of him. Your book, or rather your section on him, was very illuminating. It was very interesting. I found this out. I think actually it might have been in your book. He was the second biological son to become emperor, so to inherit, as it were, the role. Only the second, which is incredible when you think about how many emperors there had been at that point.
Yeah, so the first one we have is like Titus, which is in 79 AD, succeeding Vespasian. And then we have to wait all the way to, what are we up to? Is it 180 something? I can't think.
He reigns 180, yeah. Commodus comes into power, I think it's 180.
Yeah, so we have to wait all the way to kind of 180 to get another biological son to inherit the throne.
It must be very difficult because Marcus Aurelius had a very, very tricky choice. What do? Your son, you've got a biological son, you've made him consul. You can't not choose him. He's going to have to be the next emperor, because if he isn't, whoever comes in, the first thing they're going to do is get rid of him. So you don't really have a choice, or they don't, and then there's absolute civil war, which no one really wants as their legacy. How did he achieve the role, and what was he like initially? Was he anything like Caligula in the sense of being quite amiable to start with?
He's not really amiable. I mean, the thing about Commodus is he comes at the end of this kind of dynasty, the Antonines, who were held up by Edward Gibbon in his massive book, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He would say the Antonine period prior to Commodus was the golden era for Rome, when it was at its height and was run the best, and it's the very peak of kind of civilization. So those were the emperors, which are Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. They, in Edward Gibbon's mind, and people who read Edward Gibbon's mind, were the best of all the emperors. But when you look into the era, it's not a very stable era. There's all kinds of kind of barbarian incursions and plagues and, all kinds of dreadful things going on. So it doesn't feel like it's a very nice era. But the difference is you actually get all those emperors, none of which are assassinated. There's a kind of a smooth succession, which is quite rare for Roman emperors. Generally, one gets murdered and then another one's in their place or gets assassinated, or, something horrible happens to them. So you have 5 who each succeed each other with no bloodshed, and they're generally quite competent. But none of them are kind of next of kin kind of thing. How kind of story is that they're choosing like the best person to succeed them. They're all emperor by adoption from the previous emperor. I mean, there might be some family ties there. And then you get to Commodus, who's a natural son, and it all goes to pot. And he's, he's generally useless, and he ruins the golden era for everybody, and kind of takes the empire and just completely blows it to pieces. So, and that's probably why you don't get another son succeeding his father for quite a long time after that either. So,
I want you to tell the story of the failed assassination attempt. It happens quite early on in his reign. I think it's 182. And first of all, can you describe it? Because it did, again, when you wrote it in your book, I did laugh, and I felt bad at laughing given what the context of it all. Also, do you think that changed him much at all?
The assassination attempt, I'll do the assassination attempt first, because it is quite funny. And the guy whose name I'm not even going to try and pronounce, he has a perfect opportunity. He's there standing in front of Commodus with a dagger, and he's got the opportunity to stab him and kill him right then and there. But instead, he stops and he makes a little speech about exactly why he's killing him. And even like Herodian says, he takes so long making this speech that he'd wasted time. And then the palace guards, spot what's happening and kind of wrestle him to the ground. So much in the way of a kind of Bond villain, you must explain exactly why you must die, Mr. Bond. He just spent too much time.
I'm just going to take you on a tour.
Explaining it. Yeah, so and I think that is the world's most useless assassination attempt, because we say, it's getting access to an emperor and, with weaponry is not easy,
No.
away from the guard. And he had the perfect time and he blows it. But Cassius Dio, the historian who was alive during Commodore's time, was a senator under Commodore, so he knew him. So we got first-hand accounts here. Always said that, there was nothing wicked about him, but he was just a bit simple. And he was a bit gullible, and he was easily led, and people took advantage of that. So he comes from the point of view that he wasn't a wicked, mad, cruel person. He was just a bit guileless, is how he puts it, and people exploited that. And only had first-hand account of Commodore, so I think we have to kind of bear that in mind that he met the guy. He didn't like the guy. He slags him off plenty and tells plenty of terrible stories about him. But the fact that he says, he wasn't naturally wicked, I think holds some weight.
That's an interesting comment to make. Really interesting comment to make. I hadn't heard that, because you'd think he'd have it very much in for him. But it's almost more pitiful that he just says he wasn't even good at being bad. He was just not particularly good.
He has a wonderful story, Castillo, which I think is one of the best anecdotes ever. Is, Commodore, as we'll probably cover, liked to dress up as a gladiator and fight in the arena, and he would force the senators to watch this. So they were forced to come and watch this. And he's doing his thing, and he decapitates an ostrich, and he comes and he stands in front of the senators, and he waggles his decapitated head at them as if, they're going to be next, and, big warning to them. And they get a fit of the giggles. And they can't. And Cassius Dio says he had to stuff kind of laurel leaves in his own toga in his mouth to stop himself from laughing. So, the idea that, he's this terrifying... obviously some of it's going to be nerves as well, nervous laughter, but it kind of casts new light on it that this man is ridiculous in a lot of ways. And, other historians will say, the last part of his reign, was he just drunk? The question is raised, was he just blind drunk during the latter part of his reign? Because it's all just bonkers. And he just casts a foolish figure. I mean, yes, he's scary and people die and people are executed, but he's laughable in a way because it's so over the top.
He changed or went about trying to change the name of Rome and the calendar.
Oh, yes.
He wanted to change the calendar so each month was one of his names.
Yes. So, yes, he wanted every month would be named after himself. He wanted to call Rome after himself. And I'll see if I can find it. I had a list of all the titles he gave himself. Let me just see if I can find it. Yeah. So this was what he wanted the Senate to address him as. Okay. Which is the Imperial Caesar Lucius Aulus Aurelius Commodus Augustus Pius Felix Sarmatico Germanico Maximus Britannicus, pacifier of the whole earth, invincible, the Roman Hercules, Pontifex Maximus, holder of the tribunal authority for the 18th time, imperator for the 8th time, consul for the 7th time, father of his country, consuls, praetors, tribunes, and the fortunate Commodus Senate, greeting. And that was like how he was introduced in the Senate every time he kind of went in, which is just, it's quite something.
Yeah, I suppose he's got a whole branding thing going on, hasn't he? He's consistent. He wants himself addressed that way, and Rome changed, and the calendar changed.
It's amazing they had any time to discuss anything in the Senate after they'd done that big intro.
The meetings must have been half of the meetings taken up by him introducing himself or being introduced. You mentioned the gladiator, and actually, I imagine most people will know him from Gladiator, as I mentioned earlier. He fought as a secutor, and if you aren't aware, they were quite interestingly armed. They had a scutum, a shield. They had a gladius, which is a short sword, and they had this helmet that covered most of their head. I've always found that quite an interesting choice of outfit, simply because he seems to have been someone who wanted everyone to see him and know who he was, and yet he chose a gladiator kit, which effectively hides who you are. But I always found it a bit of an odd look for someone who wanted to be so visible to everyone.
The gladiator thing gets the worst press, but he did a lot of beast hunting as well, and he actually gets some kind of credit in the sources for this. I mean, it's not our cup of tea in this day and age. It's, it's all brutal, horrible stuff. But, Herodian mentions that in the arena, he could take 100 javelins and kill 100 lions with those 100 javelins, which is, is quite something. He decapitated ostriches with archery with these kind of curved arrows that kind of went and kind of swished their heads off. he's praised for this. He's praised for his marksmanship and his skill, and that it was generally admired as being quite skillful. And it is quite skillful. It's horrible and horrific, but it's skillful.
Yeah.
But where he falls down with the gladiator thing is because it's fighting, and because Rome is about battles and fighting a decent enemy. Rather, Marcus Aurelius spent most of his empire career out there fighting barbarian tribes who are threatening the empire. And what's his son doing? His son isn't fighting, a good enemy.
No.
He's just farting about fighting gladiators, who are the lowest of the low. And that's where the kind of line is drawn. There's there's admiration for his skill in beast hunting, but dressing up as a gladiator is beneath the dignity of a Roman emperor, rather.
I mentioned this, and I spoke about it on the episode I did on Rise of the Gladiators. I don't think people realise just how low gladiators were held.
With both of those kind of things, the level of skill that he was showing shows that's what he was dedicating his time to.
Yeah.
Becoming a really good gladiator, becoming, a really good beast hunter, when surely he had better things to be doing, like running the empire, for instance.
He doesn't seem like he's interested in the institutions of the state other than threatening them with heads of large birds, which is, not really the best way of doing business. How does it come to the end then for him? How does it all end?
It takes a long time to get there. It takes 12 years, and there's all kinds of ups and downs in the middle. As we're saying, that he's concentrating on being a gladiator and fighting and being a good beast hunter, and he hands over kind of power to right-hand men. First one is Perennius, who kind of takes over the running of everything and then gets too big for the boots. And people actually have to go to Commodus rather to tell him this is happening, and tell him that Perennius is taking too much power. Perennius is going to make his sons his heirs, and he's going to lose the role. They actually have to physically go and tell him for him to notice this. And then Perennius gets executed and his sons gets executed. And then he does exactly the same thing again with a guy called Cleander, who's a freedman, who again gets too big for his boots and starts selling consulships to anybody.
Right.
Whether they be free or ex-slave, which is a big no-no, Rome being a very class-based society. And he does exactly the same thing again. And again, people have to come to him to tell him, this is happening. Cleander's got too big for his boots. He's threatening you. You could be on the way out. I think that's quite interesting in that he's obviously not very good at choosing right-hand men.
No.
They're not trustworthy. And he's just not paying attention. He's just letting this kind of thing happen. And I was discussing this with a friend of mine, S.J. Turner, who's a historical fiction writer, writes lots of very good Roman books, and wrote one on Commodus. Did a Damned Emperor series. We did Caligula, Commodus, and Caracalla and Domitian. And he told me his theory was that Commodus was bipolar, which I thought was really, really interesting, because that would explain these periods where he's not noticing what's going on because he's hiding in some villa and Cleander's taking power, and he's not noticing because he's maybe in a depressive state and shut himself away.
Yeah.
And then grandiose behaviour maybe goes with that kind of manic energy of, naming the months all after yourself. I think there's maybe something there. I mean, you can never diagnose anyone from 2,000 years ago, but I think there's something there that's, could be interesting.
It's a very interesting idea to consider historical characters within the framework of sort of mental health. And you're right, it is incredibly difficult to the point of nigh impossible to actually diagnose them. Well, knowing what we do now about how people work, how they exist on spectrums and things like that, there's no reason why we can't explore that idea with historical characters. So, I think it is a very interesting thing to try and consider. Again, though, with the caveat that you can only do so much.
Yeah, and I think you could also just say Commodus is also the first emperor who's actually born to the purple, in that he was born when his father was already emperor.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to say, well, that's going to give you ideas of grandeur, isn't it, from the beginning? So it could just be he was born to this world in which he is told he's going to be emperor, he's going to rule the world, and, that just goes to his head kind of thing, as it might do to many of us, given unlimited power, we'd all name a month after ourselves, surely.
Well, I don't. I always find it funny when people talk about people in, shall we say, the entertainment industry, and they say, do you believe how so-and-so acts? If you keep telling people they're the most important thing on the planet, that everything they do is amazing, and they start going through a part of their life where they can tell anyone what they want to do, don't look at me in the eyes, I need this in my dressing room. I'm not trying to compare any entertainment person, shall we say, with Commodus, What I'm saying is there's a similar line of behaviour where people will behave until they're checked. And in certain industries, people don't get checked and they want to be treated in such a way that is beyond the merit of anyone else on the planet, pretty much.
Yeah, and you can sort of say emperors are so high up that they are beyond the merit of anybody else. So they're in a different plane, they're in a different existence to everybody else, and they are treated in a very different way. And not everybody has the strength of character to kind of resist that and not believe your own press kind of thing. So I'm not really surprised. I mean, the end comes from Commodus after many assassination attempts. I mean, just summing up his kind of relationship with the Senate, in that he has a gold statue of himself as an archer put in front of the Senate House, where he's aiming his bow at the Senate House, which I think kind of sums up. Yeah, he was nothing. He was not really subtle. But in the end, he's poisoned. It's a kind of conspiracy of a Praetorian prefect with his mistress, and they poison his beef, which he then throws up, and they have a panic. So they send in a wrestler called Narcissus, who strangles him in his bath, and that's the kind of end of Commodus. So again, it's kind of Axis again. You need the people who are closest to him to be in these plots. If you need the guard involved, because they're going to be the ones standing next to him.
Yeah.
And if you haven't got them involved, then you're not going to get near. You're not going to get near an emperor to assassinate them, basically.
Oh, completely. We'll come then to our last emperor. Our final emperor is a little more complex because the political and social landscape he found himself in was very different from the other two. In the 4th century, you've got the Western and the Eastern Roman emperor. Though this emperor predated the formal split, it was still pretty much the case in his time. In fact, it was his father who had 2 emperors in place, one at Constantinople in the east, and in his case, in Milan in the west. That's where the imperial court was at this time. There was also the issue of religion. By this point, Christianity was the religion of the empire, but there was tension between 2 factions within it, and this was essentially another spinning plate to deal with. The final emperor is and wasn't an emperor, and this was part due to his age, but even as an adult, he was at best a sort of token emperor with no real power. There was also a power-sharing structure, or sort of, in place at this time. It's all a bit complicated. Anyway, you've probably guessed this one. His name was Valentinian II, and he ruled in the late 4th century. So, LJ, I gave a very basic and somewhat muddled overview of where we are with Valentinian II. Perhaps a major point to consider here is that there was that different power structure in place with a ruler in the east and in the west. But even then, there was a senior ruler and a junior one. Have I got that right?
Yeah, you'd have like an Augustus and a Caesar, the kind of two, which is what Diocletian came up with, the kind of junior and senior partner, and that kind of been the pattern going back comes centuries, maybe not formalised.
No.
But Valentinian's father, Valentinian I, he was he was sharing power with Valens, who at that point he was out in the east, so there was a kind of power sharing going on there. And Valentinian I had a son called Gratian, who was 16 at the time, so he's not terribly old either, who was very much thought that he would be the successor to his father. And Valentinian I died very suddenly whilst out on campaign. Not on campaign, didn't die in a battle or anything that kind of heroic. He was sorting out a peace treaty with the tribe he'd been fighting, and they upset him. They were a bit...
I shouldn't laugh again. I shouldn't laugh, but yeah.
I shouldn't laugh. No, I shouldn't laugh. He said something that he took offence to, and he got really, really cross. And he evidently had a terrible temper anyway.
Yeah.
And he got so cross that he had what sounds like a stroke and just dropped dead. And they're out on campaign at that time, and all these officials standing around the kind of dead body of Valentinian I have a kind of collective panic because they're surrounded by soldiers, by legions. In the previous century, we'd had like a 3rd century crisis where the legions had made the emperors, and we had one every sort of 1.83 years. I think I worked it out. It was, there'd been a rapid turnover of emperors, so they were terrified that they were going to just choose an emperor from within the ranks, and there they are stuck with a load of soldiers who, first thing they're going to do is get rid of the officials from the previous administration. So they decide they need to quickly name an emperor, as fast as they can, and they name Valentinian II rather than Gratian. There's 2 ways you can look at this. You can look at this is because they thought they'd have more control over a kind of a younger child, because Valentinian II is only 4 years old versus Gratian's aged 16. Or you can look at it that they had a map and a ruler, and they worked out that Gratian was out campaigning several hundred further miles away than Valentinian II was, being a child, and they could get Valentinian II there quicker to show that show to the army, look, we've got an emperor, here he is, way. So that's how he ends up becoming emperor. And Gratian doesn't have much choice but to kind of accept it. And he ends up as a kind of co-ruler. And we later get another Eastern emperor called Theodosius, who becomes quite famous and gets the epitaph the Great, because he does great things, which Valentinian II doesn't really at all.
No, doesn't do. Well, I won't give it away too much, but let's just say his resume of achievements is somewhat lacking.
Yeah, I mean, his signature is on edicts and things like that, because all the emperors that are ruling, are putting their names to things. But how much he's involved in this, is anyone's guess.
So you've got this 4-year-old, presumably he's sort of not yet emperor, he's this co-ruler under Gratian. Again, just so everyone understands, this is the Western Empire. It's ruled largely out of Milan. Well, that's where the imperial court is at this time. And Gratian is not doing so well. I understand that he has the fantastically named Maximus, who decides to lead a rebellion against him. And how does that go?
How does that go? Yeah, it doesn't go well. Yeah, so Valentine II, he's got a couple of advisors for his kind of regency. There's a guy called Probus, who's mentioned, who's his advisor, and also his mother, Justinia, who is quite powerful. But Gratian gets into this war with Maximus and is killed. And then Maximus turns to Valentinian II and comes to take over. And they don't actually fight, but the line is that kind of Valentinian sees he can't really do anything.
Yeah.
And just accepts that he will rule with Maximus and they will be emperor. And then he and his mother just do a flip and run away, basically. So they agree to rule as co-emperors with kind of Maximus, who's killed his brother. And then they just run away to Theodosius and ask for help. And Theodosius comes back and wipes out Maximus and takes back what's rightfully theirs. And that's the kind of end of that rule. But it kind of sets a kind of precedent that he runs away and asks for help rather than fight.
Yeah, by this point I think he's 20, isn't he? So just to recap, Maximus has been defeated. Theodosius has made him sort of basically second in command. He's gone back to Constantinople and left Valentinian II in the West. He doesn't have his mother anymore, who was a big influence. There is still this individual who I hadn't previously mentioned and should have done, Ambrose. The story of Ambrose is St. Ambrose, for anyone who might recognise him being termed that. He never wanted to be Bishop of Milan. He was made Bishop of Milan, which then meant that he had to be baptised. And he becomes this incredibly important political figure who often checks against Justina, the empress at the time. He's a difficult challenge for anyone to have to deal with. Valentinian II is 20, and you think now he's got options. And what happens then?
Well, there's this guy called Arbogast, who's one of Theodosian's generals, who comes to court. And he just looks more empery than Valentinian II does, basically. And he wins round all the troops that are there, and he makes himself very popular with everybody. And he starts to step on the toes of Valentinian II, and he starts to make decisions that are not his to make. And Valentinian II just doesn't seem to know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
Because he's a very strong character, Arbogast, and very, very sure of himself. And Valentinian II clearly isn't very sure of himself at all. And he sends him a note dismissing him from court. He doesn't tell him outright. He hands him a note, which he just tears to pieces, obviously, and says, "I'm not going to do that." And then Valentinian II then appeals again to Theodosius for help from this, this person who's infiltrated his court. And then, a few weeks later, Theodosius receives information that Valentinian II is now dead. And there's a big question mark over how he died. Some people say he was strangled by Arbogast, and others say he committed suicide. But he's 21 years old, and that's the end of him, basically. He's weak, I think, isn't he? I think is what comes across as him. I mean, I think when he's 4 years old, that's allowable. But at 20, 21, I mean, come on, Augustus raised an army at 19. He tells us that, frequently in his writings. He's just not up to the job. He's not strong enough, and the people around him recognise he's not strong enough because they go over to Arbogast, who's the far better candidate, the far stronger candidate.
He's a good contrast to the previous two. One of the reasons that I chose him was because where you've got Caligula and Commodus, you've got these very front foot characters whose, I suppose, ultimate slide to their own disasters is in their own marrow. With Valentinian II, he's completely passive. And again, with my devil's advocate hat on and feeling sorry for the guy, it seems like someone who was just given a job that they never ever wanted. And that's what happens when you put someone like that in that role. Imagine you're an actor and imagine there's a play or a Netflix series or something, and you've got one about Caligula. Well, everyone wants to be Caligula. Caligula's going to have the best lines. And now there's going to be one made about Commodus. Well, everyone will want to be Commodus. And then when you get to Valentinian II, it's no one wants to be Valentinian II. Everyone wants to be Justinia. They want to be Ambrose. They want to be Arbogast. They want to be Theodosius. They want to be all of these other characters. He's almost this gap in the middle of everything. To that extent, I feel sorry for him. But it's just a good exploration, I think, of what can make a bad emperor. Well, it isn't necessarily having the wrong type of skills. It can just be not having skills.
Yeah, and I have a few examples of that in the book of people who get the job and then find when they get there, they're just not up for it. They're just not up to it. And I think that Valentinian II is living in a very different world to Caligula and Commodus, because he's living in a world where really anybody can be emperor now. All you need is a bit of army support, and people who would never be able to be emperor, say back in Caligula's time, the children of slaves, of freedmen. If they've got an army behind them, they can become emperor. Yeah. Anybody can. So he's in a slightly different world to Caligula, and I think that shows that, if somebody looks like a more likely candidate, they have a good chance of being emperor. It doesn't matter about their bloodline, etc., or, whether they're born to the post or, whether their father was an emperor. That's out the window by this point.
It's difficult because if you did come up with some sort of rubric by which you can judge or assess emperors, it's out of date pretty quickly.
It'd be interesting to think about those emperors, Julian Claudius. Would they have been any good in this era when they got Vandals and Goths and whoever coming at them? It's difficult to weigh out. It's such a huge period of time. It's the equivalent of looking in British history at Queen Elizabeth I versus Margaret Thatcher. It's that length of time.
Yeah,
things are very different.
But it is a testament to your book that you take all that on. I would strongly recommend it if you're someone who's interested in this. And I think the other thing which you haven't spoken a great deal about, which I think would, if we had longer, take up more time, is you do talk about the sources and how the sources are really important in what we understand and how we understand it. And they do frame much of what we know about these emperors. I think we got the time, though, if we can, to pick up some questions, because prior to this episode, I asked on social media a few places, got any questions? We got a good few questions. I've selected a few of them. Sorry if your question's not on here. Didn't get a chance to deal with all of them. And thank you very much to the nice person who said something very nice about RJ Trafford. That was very nice of you. You said you didn't have any questions. Nice. I just needed to tell you that this person loved you. So there we go. That's nice.
Which I love. Thank you. I love you too.
To start with then, how can we evidence if a reign was truly bad? I think that comes into the point on sources. So I suppose, how do we weigh up the sources?
Yes, the problem we have with our sources, our written sources, certainly, they're all written from one class, and they're all written by senators or equestrians, which are the two elite classes, and they're the people who tend to get bumped off by emperors. So any reign in which a number of senators get bumped off is generally going to be written about very badly. But I think we do have other sources. We do have coins, we do have inscriptions, we do have buildings, so there is other evidence we can weigh it against. And for example, Commodus, whereas we're saying with Caligula, it all feels a bit dubious and a bit exaggerated. With Commodus, there is the coin evidence that he's calling himself Hercules. There is the coin, there is the evidence he's renaming the months. There is the evidence he's given himself this big long title. So you kind of weigh up evidence using other bits of evidence apart from just written sources. There's other bits of evidence, and I think things like with Nero was clearly more popular with the people than he ever was with the Senate, because you keep getting these people claiming to be Nero years after he died.
He truly was the Elvis of his day.
He was the Elvis of his day, yes. Even where it's clear, I think one pops up in Titus's reign where he'd be well and truly dead by then. But so there's little bits of evidence that pop up that give you the other side of it. So there's ways of weighing it up.
The next one is, how can we tell in the often biased histories where unjustified revolts against an emperor cause problems as compared to when an emperor causes problems which triggered justified revolts? So I suppose it's whether or not a bad outcome is just something that's foisted on an emperor or something that they've instigated.
I think a lot of the sources are quite honest. I mean, Claudius, who generally gets it, we tend to think of as a good emperor, it'll mention at the time that he got pelted with bread because he'd screwed up the grain supply and things like that. You know, Augustus gets pelted with, I think it's sods of earth because he hasn't sorted out the veterans' land properly. So they're generally quite truthful about if there's a revolt. It doesn't come out of nowhere. They generally say what's upset the Roman mob. So I'm trying to think of one where people just revolted just for no reason. There's always a reason given. I don't think any emperor gets off scot-free and said, oh, they just revolted for no reason, it wasn't my fault. I think
the closest is actually, or the one that immediately pops to mind is the one that almost happened to Caligula, where he decides that he's going to put his own statue in the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, in the temple there. That's the sort of thing that will cause an absolute riot.
I mean, if anyone could come up with a revolt that of which no reason was given and there was no good cause and it didn't lay at the feet of an emperor, maybe it was the emperor's right-hand man who screwed it up, like Cleander or something like that. But again, the emperor should have known about that. But I can't think off the top of my head about a mob rioting for no reason that wasn't blamed on the emperor.
Well, if anyone's listened to this and they've got a one that's come to mind where you have got a revolt or riot or something bad happens and it's absolutely not the fault of the emperor or someone involved, then please send it in. Let me know. There's probably a few that I've missed, and I'll come off this episode and go, I should have mentioned that. This is a bit of a longer question, but also a very good one. I read somewhere that emperors, we are told, who were the worst, were assassinated, i.e. none of them died in their sleep. This suggests that at least part of their bad reputation in the ancient sources was due to propaganda from their murderers justifying the killing. How far does LJ think that might be true? And what does that propaganda mean for our efforts to get a truer assessment of emperors like Nero and Caligula?
I think it's very true, because what you need to be considered a good emperor is a successor to big you up.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a successor to big you up, then they're going to damn you. There's a good example of this in the case of Vitellius, who's one of the emperors in the Year of the Four Emperors. And he's not assassinated, but, he's horribly killed. And Vespasian comes in to be emperor, and he rules for a good 10 years afterwards, and the dynasty keeps going for like 20 years. So they got a long time to spin exactly why Vitellius had to die so horribly. And they got a long time to spin, well, he was terrible emperor because he did this, and he was an awful person, and he was cruel, and he was this, because you don't want to be the guy who murdered their way to power. You want to be the good guy. You're the good guy that saved Rome. You're not the good guy, you're not the bad guy that killed the guy in charge. So, I think it plays a huge part in what happens to your reputation.
Thank you very much for the questions. Apologies again, we couldn't get to more of them. Is there anything coming as we come to the end, LJ, that you want to talk about or mention? Anything we've missed?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether to mention Trajan in connection with assassination, because I thought that's quite an interesting one, because Trajan takes over from Nerva, who isn't assassinated, but the Praetorian Guard do storm the palace and hold like a knife to his throat.
Oh.
After which he then names Trajan as his heir. And there's always a big thing about whether they were in on it, and I think that's quite an interesting one, because Pliny does a little speech, a little panegyric about Trajan, and says, the Guard did it for you because they knew that Nerva wasn't a good emperor, and they knew they had to force your hand so that you would stand up and be emperor and sort all this out. So that's kind of an assassination that didn't happen but could have happened, and the justification that has been put in place is, the Guard, they knew they needed a better emperor. So that was just on my mind, because I was just thinking that's an assassination that doesn't happen, and a good emperor does come in place and tries to spin it as a good thing. What am I working on now? I did a book on sex and sexuality in ancient Rome, so now I'm doing sex and sexuality in ancient Greece, which is very interesting and controversial.
There's nothing, and you can't find anything. There's nothing on pots. There's just no reference at all. It must be really difficult trying to find any source material.
I've just got piles of books surrounding me with all very rude pictures on the front and titles.
Yeah, some of those Greek pots, they do tell a story.
They don't half, yeah.
Okay. Well, just to mention again, though, you did the Sex and Sexuality in Ancient Rome, and you were on this podcast. So if your ears prick up, pun intended, on that, then you can always go back through the back catalogue and have a listen to that, because we have a great fun talking about things, as you might imagine.
Yeah, that was a very fun one to do.
And I think hopefully when your book's out for the Ancient Greek, Sex and Sexuality in Ancient Greece, you'll come on the podcast and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
And I'll have to put an 18 certificate on, I think, on the episode.
Yeah, I have to see how far we can push it.
Yeah.
Because we pushed it quite far last time. But
Anyway, look, I just want to say I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. It's been great fun. If people want to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Probably on Twitter's best. I'm just at Trafford LJ, or I'm on Facebook somewhere as well. So that's probably the easiest way.
If you follow me, you'll find LJ, I'm sure, because I often retweet her stuff. Well, until next time, thanks again. Thanks for everyone for listening, if you're still with us. And thanks, LJ. That was great. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.